After 25 years in prison, Gustavo Colon was finally supposed to come home. His people had a limousine waiting, his suit was pressed, everything was ready for the return of one of Chicago's most powerful gang leaders, except Colon never made it to the car. At 4:15 that morning, federal agents walked into his prison, put him in handcuffs, and drove him straight back into federal custody. Because while Colon had spent a quarter century behind bars, prosecutors believed he had somehow built and controlled a multi-million-dollar drug empire on the outside. And the strangest part was, they already knew exactly how he was doing it. Now, how does a man run a $6 million drug operation without ever standing on the block he was operating on for nearly 25 years? Through a phone line the government recorded every time he picked it up. To answer that, we have to go back to the neighborhood that made a 14-year-old choose a side before he'd finished growing up. Wicker Park, Chicago's near northwest side, 1963. Puerto Rican families arrived by the thousands, pushed out of Lincoln Park and the near west side by highway construction and urban renewal. They landed in Wicker Park because it was what they could afford, and the people already there made sure they knew they weren't welcome. The Gaylords, the Taylor Jousters, the Playboys, Ventures, and PVPs ran those streets. You moved onto their block, you paid for it. The police weren't protection, they were another problem. So the Puerto Rican kids on Levitt and Schiller organized. That's where Gustavo Colon came up, 14 years old, alongside a kid named Jose Rivera, later known as Cadillac Joe. His first crew wasn't the Latin Kings. It was the Warlords, a Latin Kings softball team that broke off into its own outfit in 1964 and ran allied with the Kings for decades after. But Colon wouldn't stay on that corner for long. On June 27, 1971, 16-year-old Glenn Burr walked out of his home on North Levitt with 4 friends. Colon, also 16, was outside with a gun. Burr ran. Colon opened fire, killing him, then turned the weapon on a girl in Burr's group and pulled the trigger. She survived only because the gun was empty. Colon was arrested 2 months later, convicted of murder in 1972, and sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. And while Colon was beginning what should have been decades away from the streets, the corner he left behind was becoming even more dangerous. Years later, Levitt and Schiller became a safe house for the FALN, the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, a Puerto Rican nationalist paramilitary group responsible for more than 130 bombings across the United States between 1974 and 1983. The Latin Kings sheltered them there until federal agents closed in and the gang abandoned the corner. Colon was already behind bars, but it shows the kind of environment he had come out of, one where gang politics, ethnic tension, and eventually political violence stretched far beyond ordinary turf wars. He was arrested 2 months later, and in 1972, Colon was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. He was 18 when the sentence came down. For most people, that would have been the end of their influence on the street. For Colon, it was the beginning. That same year, he became leader of the Latin Kings, a position federal courts later noted he never gave up. The prison door closed behind him at 18, but instead of disappearing into the system, Colon turned the system into his headquarters. At the time, the Latin Kings were barely surviving inside Illinois prisons. The state had 4 maximum security facilities, each holding around 1,500 inmates, and the Kings numbered maybe 15 or 20 men in each. The Disciples, Vice Lords, and Blackstone Nation outnumbered them by as much as 50 to 1. Things were not much better outside. Founder Raul Santos had lost his position to heroin addiction. Leadership was fractured, and the organization was being preyed upon from every direction. Then, Colon arrived from the north side, while another 18-year-old, Raul Gonzalez, better known as Baby King, came in from the south side. Both were convicted murderers. Both had been sentenced around the same time, and together they began rebuilding the Latin Kings from inside Stateville Correctional Center. In 1972, they completed the King's Constitution and Manifesto. It was more than gang literature. It created ranks, a chain of command, loyalty rules, discipline, and a spiritual framework wrapped in cultural pride. One of its most important laws banned drug use among members, with marijuana as the only exception. Colon had already watched heroin destroy the leadership before him, so he wrote the rule himself. That document became the blueprint for everything that followed. From a few dozen men scattered across Illinois prisons, the Latin Kings grew into one of the largest street gangs in the state, eventually claiming thousands of members in Chicago and chapters across the country. And at the center of that expansion was still the same man who had entered prison at 18. That is what makes Colon different from the typical street boss who gets locked up and tries to keep control from the inside. Colon did not simply maintain an empire from prison. He helped build the structure that allowed one to exist in the first place, and then spent the next 25 years commanding it without ever walking the streets himself. So how do you run an organization that large from a prison cell? For Colon, the answer started with one phone call almost every evening. He called his wife Marisol. Before every conversation, a recorded warning reminded him that prison calls could be monitored and recorded. He called anyway. Marisol would conference in whichever lieutenants needed to speak with him, effectively connecting a man locked hundreds of miles away to the operation running across Chicago. Federal court records later described her as his eyes and ears on the outside. She passed messages, connected lieutenants, and collected weekly street taxes on his behalf, payments that started around $500 and eventually climbed as high as $1,500 a week. She was not simply the wife of an imprisoned gang leader. She was the switchboard that allowed his authority to travel beyond the prison walls. And Colon apparently believed he could keep doing it without consequences. A year before his scheduled release, he gave an interview in which he praised the Latin Kings for maintaining peace inside the prison system while flatly denying any involvement in narcotics. "I don't involve myself in drugs," he said. "My goal is to do my time and get out of the penitentiary." The problem was that the government had been listening. At his eventual trial, prosecutors played roughly 70 recorded prison calls showing Colon involved in the very drug operation he had publicly denied controlling. Every evening, he had picked up a phone that warned him he was being recorded and continued giving orders anyway. By the time he was preparing to walk out of prison, the government had spent years turning those conversations into a case. By the early 1980s, Colon had already established something more important than numbers: obedience. A phone line, a prison visit, or a law library could only function as a command center if the men receiving his orders actually followed them, and the Latin Kings had a brutal way of making sure they did. In 1981, a Latin king named Carlos Robles disrespected Baby King inside prison. Baby King brought it to Colon, and Colon gave his blessing. But nothing happened immediately. The organization waited 2 years. Then, in July 1983, just 2 days before Robles was supposed to walk out on parole, he was murdered inside Stateville. His body disappeared so completely that the Illinois Department of Corrections listed him as an escapee for more than a decade. It wasn't until 1995, when a skull was discovered in the Stateville yard, that authorities finally learned what had happened to him. That 2-year gap matters. This wasn't Colon losing his temper. It was an organization patient enough to wait because it knew Robles wasn't going anywhere the Kings couldn't reach. And by the mid-1980s, Colon had spent more than a decade proving just how far that reach extended. He had never run a free block, driven through his own territory, or stood on a Chicago corner watching his organization operate. Everything moved through prison calls, visits, and one particular room inside Stateville Correctional Center, the law library. That was where Gino held court, not a corner office, not a restaurant back room, a prison law library where other inmates filed appeals and checked out legal dictionaries, had effectively become the boardroom of a criminal organization. His wife, Marisol, became the bridge between that room and the streets. Colon would call her, and she could connect him with lieutenants who needed instructions. Every call began with a warning that prison conversations could be recorded and monitored. Colon called anyway, night after night. Years later, roughly 70 of those conversations would be played for a federal jury, and prison itself gave him more room to operate than you might expect. For much of his sentence, Colon was housed in Menard's honor dorm, where he reportedly had the key to his own room and could move around parts of the prison while other inmates remained locked down. Like other prisoners, he was allowed telephone calls and visitors. On paper, those were ordinary privileges. In Colon's hands, backed by absolute authority inside the Latin Kings, they became infrastructure. Visitors came in, instructions went out, money moved, and Colon never had to leave the building. He wasn't even the only Illinois gang leader exploiting that system. Larry Hoover, of the Gangster Disciples, was also accused of directing his organization from prison during roughly the same era. The bigger story was not simply that Colon was clever enough to run a gang from a cell. It was that the prison system had locked powerful gang leaders away without completely cutting off the tools that allowed their influence to travel outside. Then, in 1989, Colon demonstrated just how dangerous that influence could be inside the prison itself. On July 1st, Corrections Officer Lawrence Cush Jr., 24 years old with a wife and 2 daughters, conducted a routine shakedown of Colon's cell. He found a strainer with cocaine residue and wrote Colon up for the violation. According to a high-ranking Latin King informant who later entered federal witness protection, Colon responded by summoning his inner circle to the law library and ordering Cush hit. One man suggested threatening Cush's family instead. Colon's response was simple: interfere with the order and you could be hit too. That afternoon, 2 Latin Kings attacked Cush. He suffered severe head injuries and died the following evening. Think about what that says about Colon's position. A corrections officer inside a maximum security prison writes a disciplinary report. Within hours, the inmate he wrote it against allegedly orders his death, and other inmates carry it out. Colon wasn't simply controlling people on Chicago streets he couldn't physically reach. He had enough authority inside the prison itself to turn a piece of disciplinary paperwork into what amounted to a death sentence. And 1989 exposed another contradiction. That same year, Colon pleaded guilty to heroin possession with intent to deliver. He maintained that he had been framed, but the charge sat awkwardly beside one of the central rules Colon himself had helped write into the Latin Kings Manifesto. Members were not supposed to use drugs, marijuana being the exception. The rule existed partly because Colon had watched heroin addiction destroy the leadership that came before him. Now the man who helped write it was pleading guilty to a heroin offense himself. Yet, even with that level of control, Colon's empire had limits. By the early 1990s, Chicago Tribune reporter Gary Marks documented a serious fracture inside the Latin Kings. Colon controlled the predominantly Puerto Rican Northside faction from prison, while another leader was building an independent power base among the heavily Mexican Southside membership. two power centers were emerging inside one organization. Violence increased, discipline fractured, and for perhaps the first time, Colon was dealing with something his prison-based command structure could not completely solve: a rival who could actually walk the streets Colon had not seen in decades. But the split never destroyed Colon's North Side operation. That machine kept running through lieutenants, visits, phone calls, money collections, and the hierarchy he had spent decades building. And eventually, that machine gave federal prosecutors exactly what they needed. There is a legal term for what they believe Colon was running: a continuing criminal enterprise. The statute is designed for kingpins. Prosecutors have to prove a continuing series of drug felonies committed while organizing or managing at least 5 other people and deriving substantial income from the operation. Suddenly, everything Colon had built started looking less like evidence of his power and more like evidence for his prosecution. The hierarchy, the regional bosses, Marisol connecting him to the streets, the drug operation, the recorded calls, the men who treated his instructions as orders. For decades, that structure was what allowed Colon to rule from prison. Eventually, it would become the structure the federal government used to make sure he never left. By September 1997, the machine Colon had spent 25 years building finally had a name in federal paperwork: Operation Los Cuatro Reyes, the Four Kings. It was a multi-year investigation run jointly by the DEA, Chicago police, and federal prosecutors, all working their way into the Latin Kings drug network from the outside in. And what they documented, call by recorded call, was remarkable for one simple reason. Colon was negotiating multi-kilogram cocaine purchases from a prison telephone. The deals moved through his wife, through his lieutenants, and through a supplier named Rene Herrera, while the man directing it all never once stepped outside Menard Correctional Center. Then, on September 18, 1997, the government moved. The indictment was unsealed just 24 hours before Colon was scheduled to walk free. 14 defendants were named. Colon, listed under the aliases El Magnate, Boss, Gino, Lord Gino, and Jefe, was accused of running a conspiracy that moved an estimated $6 million in crack cocaine, powder cocaine, marijuana, and heroin through Chicago between 1995 and 1997. Part of the operation ran through an apartment at 2420 North Kedzie Avenue. His wife, Marisol, was charged as the operation's top street administrator. Regional bosses Jose Sufron and Jorge Martinez were charged alongside her, as were Wilfredo Escobar, Rene Herrera, Ariel Genjuama, Cesar Diaz, and others lower down the chain. 9 defendants were already in custody that Thursday. 5 others were still being hunted, including Charlie Alejandro, believed to be in Puerto Rico, and Sufron, eventually tracked to Springfield, Massachusetts. For Colon, the timing was brutal. After 25 years in state prison, freedom was one day away. Interim U.S. Attorney Scott Lassar made the government's position clear. If Colon was convicted, he would never walk free. And one transaction from the case showed exactly how strange Colon's version of running the streets had become. On August 14, 1997, Colon, Martinez, Herrera, and Diaz allegedly arranged a deal involving roughly 3 kilograms of cocaine in a parking lot at 51st and South Kedzie. Colon was nowhere near the scene. He was still inside Menard, working through a telephone receiver. Herrera was the one physically sitting behind the wheel of a Chevrolet Tahoe when an informant and undercover agents closed in. When agents drew their weapons, Herrera rammed several law enforcement vehicles and took off. The chase carried across the city before he managed to lose them, but not for long. Agents caught up with him when he pulled up to his own home in Westchester. That was Colon's empire in miniature. He negotiated from a cell 200 miles away while other men drove the cars, carried the drugs, met the buyers, ran from police, and got arrested. He remained behind the walls, removed from nearly every risk his orders created. But distance did not save him once the case reached court. The trial ran for 9 weeks, and prosecutors had something Colon had been handing them for years: his own voice. Roughly 70 recorded prison calls were played for the jury. Colon had made those calls knowing the prison system could record them, and the pattern prosecutors presented was remarkably consistent. Orders given, orders acknowledged, orders carried out. The district court later described the hierarchy directly. Every witness treated himself as subordinate to Gino Colon, and there was unanimous agreement on his authority. Herrera testified that he delivered a little over 44 kilograms of cocaine to the operations street lieutenants, with more coming from 2 other dealers. The sentencing court ultimately held Colon and his co-defendants responsible for between 50 and 150 kilograms, and the evidence was not limited to drugs. When police searched Souffron's apartment, they found a .38 caliber handgun and cocaine hidden inside a fire extinguisher with a false bottom. Colon was later caught on tape discussing having Souffron shot as punishment for leaving incriminating evidence where police could find it. Souffron's own recorded conversation with Colon independently confirmed what officers had recovered: the gun, the cocaine, and the fire extinguisher. Prosecutors also introduced a photograph seized from Martinez's home. It had been taken more than a decade earlier inside Pontiac Correctional Institution in 1986. Colon stood with Martinez, Escobar, and several other men throwing a Latin King's hand sign. Above them were the words, "Arriba la gente," long live the nation. Beneath them was one word, "gunmen." The defense fought to keep the photograph from the jury. The court allowed it, finding that it spoke directly to the relationship among the men and the violent posture connecting them across more than a decade. To the sentencing court, the weapons were not incidental. They were part of the structure protecting the drug operation. Then the case nearly developed a crack of its own. During post-trial proceedings, prosecutors disclosed that Chicago police officer John Woodall, who had testified about the search of Souffron's apartment, was himself under criminal investigation for allegedly stealing narcotics during an unrelated stop. The disclosure was serious enough that the judge considered striking Woodall's testimony and potentially ordering a new trial. For a moment, one of the government's own witnesses threatened to crack the case open, but Souffron had already confirmed on tape exactly what police found in the apartment: the gun, the cocaine, the fire extinguisher. Other evidence corroborated the search. Even if Woodall's credibility collapsed, the core of the case remained standing. That was the deeper problem for the defense throughout the trial. Prosecutors did not need to rely on one officer, one informant, or one questionable witness. Colon's own organization had spent years talking to itself on recorded lines. Marisol's attorneys tried a different route. They called clinical psychologist Dr. Teresa Risolo, who testified that years of marriage to Colon had left Marisol with a dependent personality disorder. She struggled to express disagreement, was easily directed, and had built much of her adult life around deferring to a husband she married while he was already incarcerated. The defense presented her less as an independent administrator than as a woman conditioned to obey Colon. The jury heard it. They convicted her anyway, and one by one, the rest fell with her. Colon was convicted on all but one of 21 counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, using a telephone to facilitate drug felonies, and distributing cocaine. Marisol was convicted on 3 counts tied to her role in the operation. Souffron and Martinez went down as regional bosses who had taken orders from a man they had never known outside prison walls. All 4 appealed, attacking the withheld Woodall evidence, the prison photograph, sentencing calculations, the joint trial, and more. In 2003, the Seventh Circuit rejected every argument. Its reasoning returned to the same problem the defense had faced from the beginning. The weight of the evidence was staggering. After 9 weeks of recorded conversations, the defendants had largely convicted themselves with their own voices. For Colon, the final consequence had already arrived 3 years earlier. In 2000, a federal judge sentenced Gustavo Colon to life in prison. The sentencing calculation showed exactly how the court viewed him. The drug quantity pushed his base offense level to the top, weapons pushed it higher, and his role as organizer raised it again. His criminal history landed him in Category 6, the highest tier, built partly from the 1971 murder conviction and the 1989 heroin plea. There was no parole date waiting at the other end. This time, no release year, no second limousine. Colon held the title of Corona, the crown, the highest rank in the almighty Latin King nation. And when the federal sentence came down, he stood as the highest ranking Latin King the federal government had ever put away. That distinction held for more than a decade until Southside leader Augustine Zambrano received 60 years in 2012. Even then, the Department of Justice described Zambrano as the highest-ranking Latin king convicted since Colon, because before him, there had been nobody bigger. But a life sentence solved the government's problem with Colon more cleanly than it solved the problem of the organization he had built. While he sat in federal custody, another multi-year investigation, Operation Broken Crown, ended with the arrest of Fernando Ace King and at least 20 other Latin Kings leaders. The gang kept promoting members. It kept distributing drugs. It kept expanding. Under the Chicago Motherland faction, its reach was eventually reported across 158 cities in 31 states, with membership estimates between 20,000 and 35,000. And underneath all of it remained a structure built around a constitution written inside Stateville in 1972 by an 18-year-old who had just been sentenced for murder. That may be the clearest measure of what Colon built. After 25 years shaping the organization from prison, the organization no longer needed his physical presence to survive. The years since have been quieter. Colon earned his GED, completed college-level coursework, and took programs aimed at addressing the criminal thinking that put him behind bars. His attorney has argued that the 16-year-old who shot Glenn Burr in 1971 bears little resemblance to the man who has now spent more than half a century incarcerated. But every legal route toward release has closed. During the COVID-19 pandemic, his lawyers sought compassionate release, pointing to his age, high blood pressure, and body mass index as factors that made him medically vulnerable. The request was denied. In 2021, they tried again under the First Step Act of 2018. The district court denied that request too, and in 2024, the Seventh Circuit affirmed the decision, ruling that his continuing criminal enterprise conviction was not a covered offense under the act. The federal government's position has remained essentially unchanged. Given his leadership of the Latin Kings and the crimes tied to that leadership, the life sentence was within the guidelines and justified. His brother Cristobal ended up on almost the opposite path. Once a Latin King himself, Cristobal became pastor of God's Army Ministries on Chicago's Northwest Side and spent decades counseling people trying to lead the same kind of life that had consumed his brother. He has said he would support Gino if he were ever released. One brother chose the crown, the other chose the cross. But for Gustavo Colon, there was never a public reinvention. No ceasefire press conference. No second act outside prison walls. He entered the Illinois prison system in 1972 at 18 years old, and more than 50 years later, he remains in federal custody. The organization he helped shape did not disappear with him. The Constitution written at Stateville became the foundation of a gang that spread far beyond the handful of inmates Colon first encountered in Illinois prisons. And that leaves one question. What does it mean to build something so powerful that 25 years behind bars cannot remove you from it, and even a life sentence cannot erase what you created? The limousine answers part of it. After 25 years incarcerated, Colon's people still believed he was coming home. They arranged the car, they prepared for his return. The government put him in a federal van instead. But the fact that the limousine was waiting at all, that after a quarter century, the loyalty still ran deep enough for someone to arrange it, may say more about the power Colon built than any title, indictment, or sentence ever could. He lost his freedom long before he lost his influence.